All right. So the next bit I'm going to talk about is how I keep writing. Okay. And the first one's not going to surprise you. If it's work time, I work. I think I have a very strong Protestant work ethic. And for some reason, if it's a weekday and it's work time, what I do is work. And people talk about how when they work from home, they struggle to not do the dishes and the washing and stuff. I really don't have that problem. I have my office and it is a bedroom in the house, but it is where I work and I just work. I think it's really helpful not to listen to your own self-talk. And it took me a while to notice. I've actually now got to the point where I have this self-talk and I notice the self-talk. So I'm like this multiple people watching myself. So there'll be this person saying, this is terrible, this is boring. And sitting on top of that, there'll be this me saying, yeah, you always feel that at this point. And then there's this other person who sits on top saying, yeah, just get on with the work, would you? It's just got to be done and you've got to do it now. So not listening to that person who says, you can't do this, you've forgotten how to do this, this is terrible, this is boring, you don't know anything. We all think like that. And the job is to stop thinking it and just keep going. It's okay if it's terrible. It's okay if you don't know what you're doing, because unless you do something, you've got nothing. So just keep going and it's okay. So I try really hard not to listen to it or to monitor it and tell me what it is I'm up to and where I'm at. I personally, I've done quite a few literature reviews and I reckon they're the hardest thing to write on the planet. And there's this point when you're doing a literature review where you're just drowning in content. And that's probably the time when I'm most likely to think, I am not capable of bringing this stuff together. And I've just learned to just not think about it, just keep going. I try really hard to focus on the content of the thing I'm working on, so my interest in the topic, and not on the product. So the product might be report or book or whatever it is. So one of the things that I do there is that if I'm writing a document for somebody that has to sit in a template form, let's imagining we're writing a submission to Parliament or we're writing a business plan or something, and those documents have a set form. When I'm writing the first draft, I don't write in that form. I actually write into a blank Word document. So I write straight onto the computer, but I always write into a blank document first, no matter what I'm doing. And that's because I don't want the form or the defined structure to rule the content of what I'm doing. And so I always try to let the content come first. And I think that helps you to keep going, and it helps you to stop thinking about what should this be. It should be what it needs to be. And the only way of figuring out what it needs to be is to focus on the content, not the product itself. And then I try to keep doing the work without actually judging it. So as I'm writing a first draft of something, I try very hard not to say, oh, that's no good yet, or that idea is not working. I just try and keep going and not worry about that. And you'll hear that advice everywhere. It's really hard to put in practice, but it's something I try a lot. I've already said I set a deadline for myself. I try really hard to put a deadline on everything. And something I've sort of figured out is that if I reckon something's going to need about 40 hours of writing, which is about what I reckon it takes to write about 50,000 words, once you've got your content figured out, about 40 hours of writing, I try to give myself 4 weeks to do that. Okay, so this is just sort of rules of thumbs that I have for the way that I work. I try really hard not to procrastinate. I said there, if I get it done early, I reward myself by giving myself time to reflect. The reality is that if I get things done early, what I really like to do is send it to the client early so that they'll think I'm amazing. And then I also go on and do something else. That's, if truth be told, that's what I do. So I've got there, I allow time between drafts. I do that by having multiple projects on the go. So I'll work on something for a little while, and then when I'm sick of it, or when I've been through it once, I'll put it aside. Now, a good example here might be if I'm doing, say, a structural edit of a document. When I do a structural edit, I usually do it on screen the first time, and I It depends on the project. If I've got the freedom to really rip it to shreds, I might print it out and really think about the structure first. But if I don't have that freedom, I'll do it on screen. Then I always print and reread off print as a second go through it. So everything I do, I go through at least twice. And I won't ever do those two back to back, not ever. I try and leave a full day between them if I can. Otherwise, you just can't see mistakes. So having multiple projects is really helpful there because you can space out your work a little bit better. Okay, I said I'd talk a bit about motivating yourself to keep writing. So these are the things, some of the things that people suggest for being motivated to keep writing. And I'll tell you which ones I use and which ones I don't. So you see a lot of discussion in the writing literature about writing morning pages. And this idea comes from, and my brain is dead, that really well-known book about creative practice is the one where the morning pages comes from. Julia Cameron? I don't know. Yeah, my brain's asleep. Look, that's not something I do, but some people find it really helpful, and it depends a lot on how you're writing and what your writing is. I keep a bit of a diary/journal thing, but it's not really something that I do with regular practice. Some people find it really helpful. Some people will tell you that there's a difference in writing on screen versus writing by hand. And for some people there is, and I am not one of them. Okay, so I do not for a minute believe that my writing is better if I use a pen. In fact, all that happens is that I get a cramp in my hand. So I think through the keyboard, and that's how I do everything. Absolutely everything gets written straight onto a computer. There are a few different types of meditation out there, and if you're a person who does well with meditation, then a pre-writing meditation can be a really helpful way of settling your mind and getting yourself to think. So the reason I've recorded a really short pre-writing meditation is that I like to use it in writing retreats when I've got groups of people, just as a way of settling the room and getting people to focus. And I couldn't find a pre-writing meditation that was sort of genre neutral. So I recorded one. I found one recorded by, I think she might be a Japanese writer. And if you search for pre-writing meditation, you'll find it. It's really nice. But most of them are quite fiction focused and just didn't suit my work. There are people who say that they get started in the day, for the day by rereading yesterday's work. And sometimes I find that really helpful. It depends on the job I'm doing. So if I'm doing a long non-fiction project, rereading yesterday's work can certainly get me into the mindset. Something that I think is really helpful is if I'm doing, this definitely applies to non-fiction work. I don't think it really applies to fiction. So if I'm finishing today and I know I'm not going to be back at my desk till tomorrow, I resist that temptation to say, I'm going to stay here today until I finish section X, which is a really easy way of thinking. You know, you're writing a document, I'm going to stay here until I finish this section. I've come to the conclusion that that's a really bad way of writing. It's much better to stop mid-section, and it's better still to stop mid-sentence and to write next I was going to go on to. And then just stop, because when you come back tomorrow, you can start in the middle of a section again and you get your mind into it much more easily. If you come back into starting a new section tomorrow, it can be really hard to get going again. Okay, so rereading yesterday's work is helpful, but if you combine that by stopping mid-section and preferably stopping mid-sentence, you will find it much easier to get going again tomorrow. And if you're a part-time writer and you only get to write on weekends, that's even more helpful, because the relearning you've got to do each time you come back to it is such a big deal. Timed writing exercises mostly come out of the Natalie Goldberg books. And if anybody's looking for books about writing, Natalie Goldberg's work is well worth looking at. Writing Down the Bones is the one of hers that's well known, and she talks a lot about timed writing exercises. So you set your clock for 15 minutes or half an hour or whatever it is, and you're not allowed to leave your desk until the bell goes. And it is a great way of motivating yourself to keep doing some writing when you really don't feel like it. Now, if I'm doing something that I find enormously difficult, I do that. So I'll say, I'm not allowed to leave my desk until it's midday. And then I'm entitled to get up and get a cup of tea or whatever. And that way I'll find that you just make yourself keep going. And with a bit of luck, what actually happens is next time you look up, an extra hour's gone past. So timed writing exercises is great, but another way of doing it is to write to your attention span. And this is something else I do quite a lot. So however long I focus for, that's how long I write on that project for, and then I move on to another one. And I just find that's a really useful way of dipping in and out of work. And it just depends what's on the go. So how to keep writing. If your work is hopeless and you're achieving nothing, what I've written there is, well, that's just too bad, really, isn't it? If you're busy and this is the time you set aside for writing, then you kind of just have to get on with it. And I think that it's a lot of psychology. It's okay for it to be bad. Just get on and get it done. Now, that doesn't mean that if you're a word counter and you said, I'm going to write 2,000 words today, it doesn't mean you can rewrite the word cat 2,000 times and have done your 2,000 words. Okay, that's not helpful. But you can write 2,000 bad words and you can fix them up tomorrow, but at least you'll have 2,000 words to deal with. I am not a word counter. I don't find that it helps me to say, today I'm going to write this many words. And the reason that doesn't work for me is that I find the first draft words come very quickly, and most of the work is in the revision. And so the vast majority of the work that I do neither increases nor decreases the number of words that I have, but it's where the work sits. So having that goal of so many words is not particularly helpful for me. It's much better to say, today I want to work on this section, or today I'm giving this job 3 hours, something like that. Now, something else, if your work is hopeless today and you're achieving nothing today, then maybe you're trying too hard to write something that's really good. And instead of trying to write the work, maybe you should consider writing about the work. And that might just free you to write and develop your ideas a little bit. So if you try to write a short story, instead of trying to write the short story, write some notes about what the short story might be like, or the effect that the short story will create in somebody's mind when they read it. So you're writing about it or what it will be like, rather than actually trying to write it, which is easier. And you just might be surprised by how much you get done. Okay, so that's another little kind of how to keep writing strategy. And then, okay, so what if you really can't do something? What else can you do? And here are my suggestions. So there are people who tell you that you should not read in the genre that you're writing in. Look, you have to make your own decisions. I actually find it really helpful to read in a similar genre. I don't think that stealing other people's ideas is an issue if you're awake to what's going on. And I find that reading in a similar genre can really help me to think about genre issues. I read a lot about writing. And so if you can't write, then maybe reading about writing will be helpful for you. And there's a lot of books out there that talk about how to write, and just try them out, or read about grammar, or, you know, something like that. So reading about writing is helpful. If you can't write, then maybe recording yourself is a good idea. So switch the phone on, record yourself talking about your project, talking about what you want your project to be like, and you may find that you develop something great. Going for a walk's a great way to clear your mind if you really can't write. Take your recorder with you. Talk to yourself about your writing while you're out. And playing some word games can help to get your mind going. Now, the kind of word games we're talking about here would be anything that gets you doing silly things with words. My personal favourite is to write a story that does not have the letter E in it, which is really hard to do, and will get your mind going. Okay, it'll get you thinking about different words. So word games is great. Some other things about how to keep writing. So if you're a perfect draft strategy writer, you'll keep writing better if you dump that strategy. So the perfect draft strategy is when you start at the beginning of the document and you try to write every sentence in the right order, in the right way, and you don't go on to the second sentence until the first sentence is beautiful. Now, I know there are published authors who write like that, but not many, and it's a really hard way to write. Okay, it's much easier to let the writing grow and to write badly first and to fix it up later. So if you really struggle, and if you're a, few words down and delete them kind of person, really question, am I trying the perfect draft? And really encourage yourself to get rid of that as a strategy. I see my son try that. I have a son in grade 12, and he's writing an English essay yesterday about Frankenstein. And he's there going, I don't know how to write this. And they're going, well, just try writing notes and then it'll be easier. And he's just trying to write the first paragraph, and it doesn't work like that. You can't write your first paragraph first. So get rid of the perfect draft strategy. Second one, lock up the inner editor. So we've got this, we are two people. We're the creative person and we're the editorial person. And when you're trying to write a first draft, the best thing you can do is just put that inner editor in a box and put a padlock on it and push that person away, because that person's the judge, and you don't want anybody judging your work when you're doing the first draft. Doesn't matter what you're working on, you do not want that inner editor looking. I write the easiest part first. So a lot of the work that I do is work that gets built around theme. And so I pick whatever bit I think will be easiest and I write that bit first. And I find that really helpful. So just writing the easiest part, write the bit you like, and come back to the bits you don't like last. And you'll find that the thing grows. And then this idea here about the 1-inch frame. This is an idea that comes from Anne Lamott's book, Bird by Bird. And if you haven't read her book, go and get it. It's a fantastic book about how to write. She talks about how she keeps this little frame on her desk. It's a 1-inch frame, so 2.5 centimeters square. And what that does is get her thinking about how you don't need to worry about the whole project. You don't need to worry about what the whole document will look like. What you need to think about is the thing you're writing about today, be it this character, be it this scene, whatever it is, just focus on that and just try to do that, and don't worry about where it fits into the whole. And you gradually assemble your document by doing these multiple little tiny frames, and eventually you put them together. And that really does help you to keep writing, and it also helps you to break the job down into tiny little bits. Now, I've got a case study for you. So I say don't write, assemble. And what I'm going to do is talk to you about a document that I've just recently written that will help you to see what I mean by this. But firstly, plan if it's helpful, don't if it's not. So if there's this thing that goes on, should I plan, should I not plan? And you know what? Plan sometimes. If it works, great. If it doesn't, chuck it out. And there's no right way of doing this. So if you're somebody who likes to have a plan in front of you, fantastic, plan it. If you're not, don't. So I never plan a non-fiction document, ever. But I've written a few short stories. If they're not tiny, if they're a bit longer, I would plan them. And the novel I'm trying to write, yep, I planned that out. I figured out the arc of the story before I started writing it. But in a non-fiction, never plan it. So I've recently written a memoir, and I thought that you might be interested in how I went about doing that, because it fits with this don't write, assemble strategy to writing. So this is not my memoir. I do a bit of ghostwriting, and I've written a memoir that is two people's voice. So somebody else had done the interviews, and I was given around about 15 hours of recordings, and I was given the transcribed interviews. So I get nothing about what that document should look like, how long it should be, very little briefing about what the document should end up being like. And I've got these recordings. So I gave myself 4 weeks to do this job. So the way I go about doing it, the first week I listened to the interviews. I have 15 hours to listen to. I think that's the hardest part of the work, because I had to sit still and listen to the interviews. And I've done a few of these now, and it's really important to listen to the person's voice, and it's really important to listen to it all the way through. Transcription just doesn't do it. So that's week 1. In week 2, I went from the transcribed interviews to notes. So one of the things that's really big in my mind is that I have this little rule with myself that I never copy and paste, and I never cut and paste in any document. I retype. And I do that because when you type something, you know it. And the only way to really write something is to really know it. So I have these transcribed interviews sitting on one screen on my computer. On the other screen, I have my open Word file and I make notes. And they're not in any order. I'm just pulling out the things that I think will go in this book. And something that's remarkable is that the notes I generate by going through those transcriptions give me a pretty good idea of how long this book will be. So in that particular case, I had about 27,000 words of notes, and I ended up with a book that's just under 30,000 words. Absolutely fascinating. So then I build it. I've got these notes, and I build the document by looking through the notes, finding a bit I like, and writing that bit. And then when I'm bored, I go and find another bit that I like, and I write that bit. And I just keep doing that until the thing's written. So I have no idea, as I'm producing this memoir, what the key message is and what the final result is going to look like until it grows and it's done. And then when it's in a rough, almost written form, usually with a bit of messy stuff at the end, that's when I start to think about what's the key message here, what's going to go first, what order is this going to go in. In this particular memoir, so I've got two people. I couldn't work out at first, is this going to be a we voice? Are they writing, we think this? Or how are we going to do this? And eventually I ended up with sections in each person's voice. And to write the draft, I used two different fonts. So it had, this person said this, and it's first person. And then there's the next section by the other person, also in first person voice, so that you can read their own voices all the way through. So I gave myself 4 weeks. Took me 4 weeks and 2 days. I didn't quite make the deadline, but I did create a draft out of this 15 hours of interviews, create the document simply by building it. So when I say don't write, assemble, that's what I mean. You can't start a document like that by listening to it and thinking, oh, what's their key message? It's too big. You can't get your head around it. You just have to build it from the bottom up. So with that in mind, I think you need to develop your own strategies. Please don't think that I have the answer that's right for you. I've got an answer that I figured out for me that helps me to do the writing I need to do. And I listen to a lot of podcasts about writing, and I read a lot of books about writing. And there's a lot of people who think, I need to find the right way, the magical way of doing this. And there isn't one. You're not doing it wrong. You're just finding it hard because it is hard. It's really, really hard work. And you just have to figure out the way that works for you and keep at it until you develop something. So ultimately, you have to kind of stand at your desk or sit at your desk, depending on how you work, and get the pen in your hand or your hands to the keyboard and keep working until the thing's done. It's not a very nice answer, but it's the right answer. Okay, so that's all I had for that little bit. Has anybody, we got any questions now?
Yes, Renee, would you like to start? Please? I love that quote from Ernest Hemingway.
Yes, Shannon had a question about when you're writing historical fiction, how much is blending the history into a story?
Yeah, isn't that a good question? Because you need to, you want it to ring true for anybody who knows a bit about the time, but you don't want to include anything where it looks like you've included it just because you found it out. That's the trouble. And it's a very real dilemma. One of the books that I really enjoyed, that's set in the same time frame as the book I'm writing. So I'm writing a book that's set in World War II in the south of Wales. It's a story based on the life of my grandmother. And I've read a book set in the same time, set in a similar place, and I'm reading through, and there's stuff about, the kids didn't think this banana was real, and then there's all this other stuff that you think you've only put that there because you knew that kids in that era didn't think bananas were real, and therefore you had to get your carrot to get a banana. And actually, it's probably not very realistic that a poor woman in the Rhondda Valley would have come across a banana in the 1940s. You know, so how do you blend it? You just have to try and blend it for realism, and you have to try really, really hard to make sure that what you've got there is right. So another little story. I got caught up reading a book called The Death of a Typographer recently. Quite a good novel, but towards the end, they have a cafetiere bubbling on a stove. Now, anybody who knows anything about coffee knows that a cafetiere is a French press, and you don't put a cafetiere on the stove. And it just did my head in, and it just destroyed all of the other content. So you have to be so careful that you don't make a dumb mistake that your reader's going to say, that's not how that works, because it damages your credibility, even though it's fiction.
Indeed. Aoife, did you have questions that you've highlighted?
Yes. So Deborah Pryor asked, re your case study and the transcripts, did you need to verify the content with participants?
In this case, so I was ghostwriting. So the content, are we talking about my book? I'll do both. I'll do both. I'll talk about my case study and then talk about my book. So in the case study of the memoir, no, because it's their memory and their book, and they are responsible for it. And I've just written the first draft for them, so not my concern at all. And as a ghostwriter, that's very much the way it is. So I'm doing another book at the moment that's referenced, and I've made it really clear that I am not checking those references. That's not my job. The person who did the work, their name is on the book, not mine. With my Newbies in the Cafe book, so there are case studies in there. I interviewed the people, wrote the story, sent the stories for them for approval, and got their sign off before I printed the stories. Absolutely. I was really concerned about if I published these stories and somebody then said, but that's not what I said, or I'm not happy with you publishing that. And one of the participants in my book was a bit reluctant to approve her story after we'd done the interview and I'd written it, and I figured out that she didn't want her name in it, and we changed her name, and it was really easy to get her approval then. So yeah, in that kind of case, I think client approval really matters. It just depends on what your role is.
Yeah.
Aoife, was there another question?
Just a lot of really good comments from people about what they find works best for them. Renee said, write now and edit later. And Russ said, I use the writing about to help me clarify what a paragraph is to achieve. So then he's able to approach its content, context, and emotion better.
Yeah.
And Renee, did you have any other highlights that you wanted to bring out?
Indrani's just asked, what about the dialogue in historical fiction? How true would you be to the times without compromising the ability to be understood by a contemporary audience?
So if you've read it's the Peter Carey book, isn't it, where to start with you've got this voice and it takes a while to get your head around the way it's written. I think it's a really good illustration of that problem. Again, there's no right answer here. Some writers pull it off really well. I'm not convinced I'm one of them. I think that you've got to do what rings true for you and then get advice from other readers to see whether it's going to work for a wide audience. And no matter what you do, it's going to work for some readers and not all readers. And maybe that's okay. You know, maybe you can't appeal to everybody, and maybe that's all right.
Aoife, I think Helen Ross Lee, you wanted to say something there. So just there we are. Helen, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, Helen, loud and clear.
was thank you for accepting my call or my whatever. Judy, it's interesting what you're telling people. I'm sorry, I speak with a speech impediment, because my book is fundamentally a memoir of the past 12 years of my life, when I wrote a book which I wasn't supposed to be capable of writing. I suffered a traumatic brain injury 12 years ago, and it was so severe that I was not supposed to be capable of doing much at all. I've had to learn to walk and talk again, and to think clearly again, and that is what the theme of my book is about: neuroplasticity, and how the brain has been designed to re-network itself, and my brain has re-networked itself, and I now have been assessed by a Gold Coast psychologist as having an above average level of intelligence, whereas my brain was traumatized to an extremely severe degree, and I'm trying to tell every person. So my audience is every single person on this planet, to know that because of the way the brain is designed, everybody is capable of not only recovering from a brain injury, but never having to bother with memory loss, as is often affected by old age.
Thank you, Helen. Look, that's absolutely wonderful message. Judy, would you like just to comment on that, please?
Yeah, I think it's worth commenting on that idea that the audience is everybody, because there's a lot of work that we do that we think everybody should read this, everybody should take this on. So I've done a bit of work in social marketing where we often would say, gee, we want everybody right now to know about the COVID Safe app, and the government wants everybody to download it, but ultimately not everybody's going to listen. And so part of what we need to do as writers is figure out who is most likely to read and what message do we want to give to those people, because they then become our advocates and they help more people to get the message. And so that thing of how do we get a message to extend out becomes really helpful. And it's never going to be everybody. So thinking about who that subset is that we most want to be heard by is really helpful.
Yes, exactly. And it's that audience that we go out to. And Helen, let us all congratulate you on what you have achieved. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And I also have had people speak to me about how the writing process itself helps them so much. There's a friend of mine in a writers group that I'm in who also suffered severe brain trauma and is now writing. His book is about to be published. He's in the process of putting it all together. So I think it's just wonderful that you achieved this, and well done.
Yeah, I agree. Really is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions from anyone, either Renee or Aoife or anyone else? Any comments?
Can I just have one?
Yes.
Just coming back to the memoir and fiction conundrum, and you mentioned that when you're writing, you need to have some authenticity in your facts, and you know, which requires a bit of research, doesn't it, to check that you could drink Coke in the 1920s, just an example. I'm just wondering whether there is more strength in having a fiction rather than a memoir. Just be interested in your comments on that, because I'm trying to write a memoir and it's incredibly hard. I have to keep fact checking, and you know, you see, which is very interesting but also very distracting. And I'm just wondering whether I couldn't turn it into a fictitious novel instead.
Yeah, yes, you could, but it would. So there are going to be people who say that all memoir is fiction, you know, because it is your memory of it, and so no matter what you do, you've been selective, you've got your own spin on it. It, you know, it is in a sense fictionalized. They're different though, aren't they? Because in a memoir, you are talking about and reflecting on something. That's what a memoir does. So the stance of the author and the stance of the reader is different. When you read a memoir, you're being asked to reflect on. And when you're reading a novel, you're inside. And for me, that's the difference, rather than is this real or is this not real? It's that stance that I would write it from. So in a fiction, I'm going to try and get my reader to be there, and I'm going to be describing setting and describing character in a way that in a memoir, I'm much more likely to be saying, I remember this and I think this, and this is the way it happened. And there's another really key difference, and that is that in a memoir, I'm really likely to provide an interpretation for you as a reader. So I'm going to say, I've got this that I want to tell you, and I'm going to start it by saying something that's a bit contextual that helps you understand where I'm heading. And then I'm going to conclude it by drawing out the point I want you to understand. Okay, so if I've been on a spiritual journey, and that's what I'm writing about in my memoir, then I'm going to start by saying this is about spiritual journey, and at the end I'm going to say my spiritual journey is X, and it becomes like this little envelope. If I'm writing it as a novel, you need to do that work. I'm not going to tell you as reader that this is about a spiritual journey. I'm going to tell you about what's going on in the setting and what's going on in the character's head, and the reader in fiction does all the work. And if you figure out I'm telling you about spiritual journey, then fantastic. And if what you think is that I'm actually writing about sheep in a field, then that is also fantastic. It's different. Okay, so that's the difference for me. It's about where the reader's work sits and what my orientation is as writer. Yes, that was a long answer.
Look, I think also there are a lot of people, you said about memoir being fiction. I think there's a lot of people that say history can often be story, and a lot of that's sometimes debatable as well.
Of course it's a fiction. I mean,
it's a story.
You think about how we disagree on our memories of anything. It's all a perspective, and it's all constructed to give you a particular message.
Yes.
And so when I say it's a fiction, that doesn't mean it's wrong. It means that it's an orientation or a selection.
Yep, absolutely. And I think the whole question about us humans as storytellers, and that's what we do when we write. We tell story, and I think and that's why story is so much a part of what we are as human beings. Unless there's any other questions, let's move on to the third part of your presentation, Judy.
Okay. You'll be pleased to know this part's a bit shorter. So I'll just talk a bit about how to write well.